So good evening, everyone, and welcome. And I just want to officially welcome the law students from Section A of Dalhousie students. Well done, guys. It's very impressive that you all are here on such a wet night, but especially impressive that law students are here when exams are just around the corner. You know exams are just around the corner, guys. Okay. My name is Bill Leahy, and as you might have gathered from that, I teach here at the law school. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's lecture. I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about the sponsoring organizations. We have two sponsoring organizations involved tonight. One of them, I'm sure that you all are aware of, and many of you are probably here because you were invited by CESEPA to come to the lecture because you attended other events organized by that organization, and that's why you're on the mailing list. And if you didn't know about them before you arrived, you certainly know about them now. They sponsor all kinds of lectures and other kinds of events here in the Halifax community and other places, including events that deal with the interface between faith and public policy. And I certainly want to thank them for their contribution to organizing tonight's event, and particularly Chris Dover for all of her assistance in bringing this event together. The other organizing group I'm almost certain you haven't heard of. This is kind of our coming out. We call ourselves the Sagelberg Dialogues on Faith and Public Policy. I don't even think we call us an organization. We're more a process or a forum. We exist to facilitate, enable, encourage discussion and dialogue, conversation in our community about the relationship, the dynamic interaction between faith and public policy, and we're trying to create a space for those kinds of conversations that will be welcoming to everyone of all faiths, of all religious faiths, and including people who don't profess to have a religious faith but are interested in talking about public policy and faith and issues they have in common or tensions they have between each other as well. We're a project of the Sagelberg Trust, and the Sagelberg Trust exists here at Dalhousie University, located in the Faculty of Management, to honor and continue the work of Dr. Father Eric Sagelberg, who was a professor of classics here at Dalhousie and at Uppsala University in Sweden for many years. And one of the great attributes of Dr. Sagelberg was as a conversationalist and as someone who was a facilitator of conversations, a creator really of conversations in his classrooms and beyond his classrooms, certainly among his continuing students, I think they would call themselves, and many other people as well. And so one of the things that the Trust is trying to do is carry on his work in his honor and his name of creating a place in this community of Halifax for conversations on topics that he was very interested in, including the one that I've already mentioned a couple of times, the relationship between faith and public policy. I want to mention also that in addition to all of you who are attending here tonight, we are, again, thanks to CESEPA, we are live streaming tonight's event. And for those who are participating in that way, welcome. And I'll say this again later, but when we get to the question and answer session, you'll have an opportunity to participate as well. There's a chat button, I understand, on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you activate that button, we'll be able to take your questions as well. Tonight, our guest lecturer is Daniel Weinstock, who is a professor of law at McGill University, and he's going to talk about the Quebec Charter of Values, which is important in a Quebec context and in a Canadian context for many reasons, including a very immediate set of political reasons, but obviously because it does relate to the relationship between public policy and religious faith and faith communities. Before 2012, Daniel was a professor at the University of Montreal, and at that university he held a Canada Research Chair on Ethics and Political Philosophy, and he was also the director of that university's Research Center on Ethics and did a lot of work in the area of health ethics in particular. Daniel is a political philosopher. He's a philosopher. He holds his PhD from Oxford University, and the fact that he's been appointed as a law professor at McGill University, heard him interviewed on the radio to that effect this morning. I set my own skepticism aside, but the fact that he's been appointed to that role shows that he really is one of those scholars that has transcended disciplinary boundaries. His research explores the governance of liberal democracy from many different perspectives, including the effects of religious and cultural diversity from an ethical perspective on the political and ethical philosophy of public policy. His research and teaching has ranged over social and political philosophy in many different domains, including ethics of public policy, the ethics of nationalism, foundations of international ethics, politics of language and identity, democracy, citizenship and pluralism, and justice in multinational states. So Daniel could have all kinds of dialogues with himself about the place in public policy. We'll be bringing you back on a regular basis. He's published articles in all of those topics, and it's important to note in this context that he's been very active in public policy in Quebec and indeed beyond Quebec and Canada as a whole, including by being a member from 1997 to 1999 of a Ministry of Education working group on religion in public schools in Quebec. And from 2003 to 2008, he was the founding director of Quebec's Public Health Ethics Committee. I mentioned before that Daniel completed his doctorate in philosophy at Oxford University. He's also a graduate of McGill University in politics, philosophy, and French literature. And on a personal note, I want to say that I've proud to say that I've been Daniel's friend for almost 30 years. The first year of his doctorate at Oxford was the last year of my legal studies at Oxford. And we were housemates at 46 Edmonton Road, along with mostly other Canadians. We had some token English housemates as well, but mostly other Canadians. And I remember very fondly those days, primarily because of the heated but always friendly conversations we had with our other housemates around the kitchen table, often over a feed of fish and chips from the local chippy down the road, and lubricated by a lot of what we thought was very good English beer in those days. Certainly was much better than what we had available to us in Canada. And those conversations were always fueled by the incredible intellectual stimulation we all felt we were getting by being students at Oxford. And it's relevant in this context. I mentioned we came from a number of different disciplines, including law, philosophy, and economics. But one of the things we found is how much there was in common in what we were learning. And that's one of the great things about Oxford University. I think it does that as well as any place, is teach common ideas and common thinkers in many different disciplines. And the other thing about those conversations is very important that they were primarily through Canadians from different regions. And what we really were talking about more often than not was the country. And Daniel, in the conversation we just had with others a few minutes ago, you mentioned this. We were really learning about Canada from each other because we really came from all different regions across the country. So with that, I'll ask you to join me in welcoming Daniel to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. It really is a pleasure to be here. I didn't mention to Bill when I saw him, I have in fact made a move from philosophy to law faculty, and one of the things that really facilitated my transition was being able to talk about the conversations that we would have around the kitchen table at our house in 46 Abingdon Road with Bill and with Peter Oliver, who's now professor of law at University of Ottawa, about Lord Denning, and the fact that I could speak so sort of knowingly about the decisions and opinions of Lord Denning opened the door of the Faculty of Law to me, in ways that could not have been possible otherwise. So anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to see Bill again and to be back in Halifax with its wonderful weather, which I'm very happy to be able to experience for a little bit. So if I were in Montreal right now, I'd be getting ready for the debate, which is going to be held in about an hour and 45 minutes, which will have the four leaders. The leaders of the four main parties face off against one another. And at the center of their debate, there will be this thing called the Charter of Values. It's actually not called the Charter of Values anymore. It was introduced to our lexicon a few months ago as the Charter of Quebec Values. And when it was introduced as a bill, Bill 60, the name was changed, and nobody really remembers what is in the name because it's extremely long now, or it was long until it died on the order table when the election was called. It has secularism, equality of men and women. It has a lot of words in it. I think about 29 words, which nobody can remember. But so people refer to it as the Charter of Quebec Values. So I'll start by saying that my talk is called Quebec at the Crossroads, which is a very sort of dramatic and portentous title. But in fact, any election in Quebec any talk about an election in Quebec could be called Quebec at the Crossroads, because since 1976, what is normal in all other democracies, which is the normal alternance of political parties in power, first past the post electoral systems tend to generate two-party systems, and two-party systems tend to have this sort of pendulum swing thing going where one party will be in power for a couple of terms and then they'll cede power over to the other party. So we have the Conservatives and the Liberals in Ottawa. In Quebec, it just happens to be the case that every election, one of those two parties wants to break the country up. Looking at it from outside of Canada, when the PQ gets elected, you could ask yourself, well, why are Quebec, are they unhappy? What's going on? Why are they voting for this sovereignist party again? Well, in large measure, the answer sometimes is, well, because we're just sick of those other guys because they've been in power for 8 years, and we don't have anywhere else to go but the party that just happens to be sovereignist. So, it's said that politics in Quebec is a full contact sport, which it is, because every campaign really does have this either as text or as subtext that we may vote into power a party that has it as the first article of its constitution that it is its whole raison d'être is to make Quebec into a sovereign country. So Quebec is always at a crossroads, but it's perhaps more at a crossroads in this particular election because of the presence of the Charter. The Charter of Values, as I'll be referring to it now. And the Charter of Values is something that I think has taken a lot of Canadians by surprise. I think Quebecers tend to be thought of, despite the fact that they always have this sovereignist bee in their bonnet that tends to sort of perk up every once in a while. Quebec tends to be thought of, and I think if you look at public policy in Quebec over a broad range of issues, health, family policy, it tends to be a fairly progressive place relative to other places in Canada, North America. We introduced $7 a day, well, at first it was $5 a day daycare, subsidized daycare for all Quebecers who are lucky enough to get a place in the subsidized daycare. If you look at public attitudes about things like gay marriage, Quebecers were, supportive of extending marriage rights to gays before other parts of Canada. And so I think this charter, which is, I put my cards on the table, and people who've heard me or read what I've written about it will know, is something that has horrified me. It can come as a surprise. Why is this place, which in other respects has tended to be quite progressive in its public policy, why has its government put forward this piece of policy which is really looks, from the outside like it belongs to a completely different kind of political, universe, more perhaps akin to what we're seeing with some right-wing parties in Europe. Where is this coming from? How is this possible? What's it doing here? And so basically my talk is not to convince you that the Charter is a good thing, because I don't think it is, but to try to at least show you why it is that it has the robust support that it does have. About half the population of Quebec is supportive of the Charter, and this despite the fact that for 6 months the likes of me and other philosophers and constitutional lawyers have been trying to convince Quebecers that it's really not a very good idea, that it is not justifiable with respect to the kind of political ethics that we in Quebec, along with people in the rest of Canada, have come to accept around individual rights and the rights of minorities. But really to no effect. Our arguments have had the effect of, if anything, I think, perhaps strengthening the support for the charter. A well-known politician who used to be an academic but who will remain nameless in this particular context, when I asked him once, what's the biggest difference between academia and politics that you could see? He said, well, in politics, you can win an argument, but nobody knows. Right? I think that the argument against the charter is pretty decisive from an ethical, philosophical, constitutional point of view, and yet the support is maintained. The support is still there, and part of what I want to do, perhaps all of what I want to do, and we can discuss other aspects of it in the question period, is to try to explain why it has come up in this particular juncture in Quebec history, and why its support has been as robust as it has been. So, to start explaining it, you have to go back in history a little bit, and ultimately with Quebec, you have to go back to the conquest, which I won't do, but that's what you'd really have to do, but I won't. I'll take you back to 1995, which, if those of you who were around, who aren't students, remember, was when we had our last referendum, right? So in 1995, we had a referendum with a very confusing question, which nobody can quite remember, and yet we came very close to getting a yes vote on that question. Now, what would have happened had the vote been yes is something that is open to speculation and debate, but we came very close to getting a yes vote. And you'll remember that on the night of the referendum, Jacques Parizeau, who was the premier at the time, not the leader of the yes forces, he'd handed that over to Lucien Bouchard, got up before thousands of disappointed supporters and said, yes, we lost, but because of what? Because of money and an ethnic vote. Now, if you go back into the video vaults and look at that evening, you can find it on the CBC, you'll see in the sea of people in the room, a majority of people who are literally horrified. Right? There's this young woman who has tears streaming down her face. Now, these are PQ supporters. These are yes supporters. These are people who had spent the last few weeks going door to door and putting all of their energy in trying to get a yes vote. And Jacques Parizeau stands up and gives the famous money and ethnic vote speech. And there are people who are crestfallen. Now, the reason that they're crestfallen is because they viewed themselves as part of a movement which was much more inclusive than Parizeau's words had would give rise to the impression of. That was a terrible sentence, but that's what happens when you fly by the seat of your pants rather than having a script. I think if you look at the history of the Quebec sovereignist movement and the history of the PQ in particular, it really has been a modernist movement, a progressive movement. If you look at the PQ that was elected in 1976, it was a party that was elected by surprise. They weren't expecting to win, and the reasons why they won could be gone into. But they were artists, they were intellectuals, they were people largely of the left. The person who became the Minister of Cultural Communities in the René Lévesque government was a wonderful man by the name of Gérald Godin, who before that had listed on his income tax return as his job, poet. Right? That's what he was also a professor, but he was a great published poet in Quebec, and he became the Minister of Cultural Communities, and he was beloved by people in the cultural communities because he really viewed Quebec as a place that had to transcend its Catholic French-Canadian origins in order to become a modern society that would be French-speaking, right? But that would be inclusive of everybody on the territory. To be a Quebecer meant to speak French and to live in Quebec, and that was pretty much all. So, the PQ has always been a coalition of all kinds of people who are united only by one thing, namely the desire to achieve political sovereignty. But the dominant note in the PQ, I would say, certainly for the first mandate, 76 to 85, I believe, and then, I would argue also for most of the second mandate, was the progressive, state-building, modernizing, inclusive one. Parizeau's, he was apparently very drunk that night. It wasn't part of a script. He just blurted it out. Suggested to a lot of people in the PQ that, they had perhaps been too optimistic about the degree to which they had managed to root a more exclusive, ethnically based view of what Quebec society is out of the PQ. What Parizeau's words suggested is that there's us and there's them. And they just voted as a bloc, right? Now, factually, he was not 100% wrong. Anglophones, immigrant groups voted 90, 95%, Saddam Hussein kind of numbers against sovereignty. which doesn't justify what he said in any way, but he really was speaking in this us and them vocabulary. There followed from 1995 until the early 2000s a real attempt on the part of the PQ to push even further than they had in the direction of the de-ethnicization of the sovereignist movement. The dominant figures of that time are people like Lucien Bouchard, who was the leader of the Yes vote, who became premier shortly after Jacques Parizeau resigned, having resigned because largely of what he said on the night of the referendum. Now, Lucien Bouchard was a man, a very fluidly bilingual man who'd married a Jewish woman, who was very cosmopolitan in his outlook, ended up resigning from the leadership because he felt that the party perhaps wasn't willing to go as far as he would have liked in the direction of de-ethnicization and denationalization. His brother, Gérard Bouchard, he of the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, was in a way the intellectual who was laying the bases for this de-ethnicization and denationalization. He wrote a book which I don't think was translated on the genesis of modern societies, where he asked himself the question, how have certain societies, like Australia, in his conception of Australia, managed to transcend their historical origins in order to forge an identity that isn't reducible to those historical origins. And he went through a number of nations in the world, clearly not just out of sheer academic interest, but because he wanted to understand how Quebec could achieve this as well. How can we achieve an identity which is not reducible to the historical origins of the groups that constitute Quebec, be they the majority or the minority? So this was the trend within the Parti Québécois for many years. It culminated ultimately, this is potted history, but I do want to get to the charter, with the election to the leadership of a gentleman by the name of André Boisclair, who today is Quebec's Delegate General, I think in New York City, who was a young, very charismatic, extremely cosmopolitan in his outlook, openly gay man who took the party to its most resounding electoral catastrophe in history. Now, there were a lot of reasons why, which had nothing to do just with his outlook. It was revealed at a certain point, at a problematic point in the campaign, that he may have used certain illicit substances while he was a minister in the Bouchard cabinet, whilst he was actually on the job. So for the first time since 1973, the PQ under his stewardship was relegated to third-party status. They were no longer the official opposition. The official opposition was taken over by a party which itself, a few months before, was at near-death point, a party by the name of the Action démocratique du Québec, Quebec Democratic Action Party. And they rose phoenix-like from a near-death experience to official party status for one election cycle on the back of one issue and one issue only. And that issue was the issue of these words that I've spoken in Quebec more than pretty much any other words in the last 7 or 8 years, with the possible exception of Montreal Canadians. The issue of reasonable accommodations. Okay, the issue of reasonable accommodations. 2006, we have a decision of the Canadian Supreme Court, the Multani decision. Do people know, the lawyers know the Multani decision, right? They look a little stunned over there, Bill. What have you been doing to them? So the Multani decision is a decision of the Canadian Supreme Court which originates from a case in Montreal. A young Sikh boy had been playing in the playground in a very multicultural area of Montreal, and as he was roughhousing with another boy, his kirpan fell out of his clothing. The kirpan is a small ritual dagger that some Sikh men wear as a matter of religious obligation. School monitor saw it and said, "What are you doing with a knife in school?" "It's not a knife, it's a kirpan. It's a symbol of peace in my religion." "Looks like a knife to me." Now, interestingly, when the issue was raised before with the parents, the school and the parents arrived at a very reasonable accommodation. They explained to the school what the dagger symbolized. The school said, well, look, we do have to think about the security of children when it falls out like this. Although your child is not going to use it as a weapon, it could fall into the hands of somebody who doesn't understand. Well, look, if you sheathe the kirpan very tightly and the boy wears it under his clothing so that it can't be seen and it can't fall out, then you can bring it to school. Somebody complained, it made it up to the school board. The school board said, no, this reasonable accommodation is unreasonable. It is sacrificing the safety of our children to too great a degree. It made its way up to the Supreme Court. At this point, the young Multani boy is, I think, in his 30s, as these things go. But the case was obviously an important one for the history of religious freedom in Canada. And the Supreme Court, in a 9-0 decision, said, well, yes, security is an important objective that we have to enforce through state institutions like schools. But empirically, when we look at the history of Sikhs in Canada, and there are a lot of Sikhs in other parts of Canada, we haven't recorded a single incident where any harm has befallen anybody because of the presence of a kirpan. And, you know, we have to realize that schools are not completely, 100% safe zones. Kids bring baseball bats and hockey sticks to schools, and they can do a lot of damage to each other with those things as well. So, is there enough of a security risk to justify the restriction of the religious freedom that this would involve? The Supreme Court answered in a 9-0 vote decision that the answer was no. The decision was met in the rest of Canada with a collective shrug of the shoulders. Nobody really noticed the decision. In Quebec, it was seen as just lunacy. It was seen as the cherry on the sundae of this particular Canadian disease known as multiculturalism, where we are willing to sacrifice even the security of our children before the mantle of relativism, the idea that if something is part of somebody's culture, then we shouldn't criticize it. Of course, this is what the Supreme Court said, but this is the way that it was read in the rest of Canada. A media outlet, one of the main media empires in Quebec, which just happens, coincidentally, to be run by a man who last week declared his intention to run for the PQ, started essentially directing its reporters to go into the field and to find any manner of excessive religious accommodation that they could find, and that these things would be on the front page if they could find them. So for months and months and months, we would get a weekly parade of episodes, some of them completely made up, some of them exaggerated, some of them having nothing to do with the relationship of public institutions to citizens. But nonetheless, a mood was created in Quebec, and a mood which has not really relented, in which we have gone too far in accommodating religious diversity, where religious diversity becomes a stand-in for immigrants, right? Now, those are two very different things, religious diversity and immigrants, but we'll leave that aside for the time being. And that we really have to do something in order for this excessive accommodating of religious diversity, born of this peculiar Canadian disease of multiculturalism. We have to do something in order to make sure that it doesn't spread like gangrene. I'm speaking with the words people realize. You get into trouble sometimes when you're giving public lectures and you speak the voice of somebody that you're criticizing, because Weinstock compares multiculturalism to gangrene will be the headline in the... Now, all of these years, the years where this is happening, 2006, 2007, the Liberals are in power, right? They have a sort of fear when an election is called in the midst of this controversy, and now I join the two threads of my story together, the Parti Québécois, which is being run by a very cosmopolitan man, André Boisclair, wants nothing to do with a discourse of limiting people's religious freedoms, saying bad things about multiculturalism. Don't do anything about this issue. But the ADQ, the Action démocratique du Québec, decides, its leader, Mario Dumont, who was pretty much the only thing that was left there, decides that we're going to make this our issue. And they ride the issue to almost victory and to official opposition status in the 2007 election, I believe. 2007, 2008. Philosophers are a little bit waffly with dates. The PQ relegated to third-party status. André Boisclair unceremoniously shown the door, and Pauline Marois, who is presently probably getting ready to debate the three other leaders, becomes the leader. The Parti Québécois decides that it will never again allow the identity issue, allow issues around culture, the way in which Quebec, the majority, will deal with its religious minorities, with its immigrant minorities, to be owned by any party but itself. As the Bouchardists, Gérard and Lucien, had become dominant as the both political and intellectual leaders of the PQ in its denationalized and de-ethnicized version, you have people who had been waiting in the wings intellectuals like Jacques Beauchemin, like Mathieu Bock-Côté, names that probably don't mean much to you, who basically say, aha, we told you so, right? The denationalization of the Quebec sovereignist movement, the attempt to show that this is something that can belong to all Quebecers, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of whether they are recent arrivals or old stock, this could only lead to disaster for the sovereignist movement. The diagnosis that is made by these intellectuals is that in order to have a sovereignist movement, it needs to be fueled by the energy of a group that really feels itself to be closely connected, to really be a nous, the French word for we, rather than a more diffuse kind of political unit of people who don't really have too much of an ethnic or religious or cultural connection to one another. If the sovereignist movement is going to be resuscitated, according to this diagnosis, it has to be refocused, it has to be renationalized, and to some degree re-ethnicized, right? And what we're seeing today really is the culmination, or at least the first electoral test, the first real electoral test of that theory. Now, the Charter of Values is really part of a palette, part of a range of policies which the PQ government has floated. So it was elected a year and a half ago, as people know, as a minority government, and there's not much you can do as a minority when the two other parties don't really share your view of things on these issues. But amongst the policies that it has floated in this area, the Charter was one, but there's also a policy which will be enacted, as far as I know, to do with the teaching of history in Quebec's junior colleges, the cégeps, which are these strange sort of Quebec, actually quite a wonderful institution, sort of lies between high school and university. For 2 years, kids go to this thing called cégep, and the idea was, well, we have to teach Quebec history in cégep better than we do. We have to teach Quebec history in a way which will fund a deeper sense of identification with the historical destiny of Quebec, its history of victimization in the hands of nasty English Canadians, amongst other things. As you know, the language legislation, which has been enforced in Quebec in 1976, which which I would defend, which has really stabilized the erosion of French in Quebec. The suggestion was that it be extended beyond elementary and high school to the cégep network, so that people who hadn't been educated in English in Canada would, not only would they not be able to send their kids to elementary schools and high schools in English, but they wouldn't be able to send their kids to cégep either. So there's a whole range of policies which the PQ has floated in its minority status in order to shore up Quebec identity, in order to send out the message, we stand for a robust conception of Quebec identity, we stand for bringing immigrants in, but making it very clear to them when they come, that when they come, they are not coming into a multicultural hodgepodge where they can continue their lives exactly as they did in their country of origin, but they're coming to a place that has a distinct cultural project that is beyond just language that they have to sign onto. The Charter has to be viewed in that context. Remember that the first name for the Charter was the Charter of Quebec Values, right? The Charter of Quebec Values. When you actually read the Charter, article by article, you realize that it doesn't have much to do with, it has to do with equality of men and women, it has to do with secularism, values that are pretty universal. But the PR, right, of the Charter was, for people who were never going to read the Charter in its detail, was to say, we are enacting legislation which will send out a clear signal to immigrants and to religious minorities that when they come here, they have to adapt to our identity rather than our identity having to adapt to theirs, right? So the Charter has to be understood in this context of a kind of attempt at renationalizing the sovereignist movement. Now, you could say that, if that were all that it was about, why is it getting... So the sovereignist cause at this point is supported by about 35 to 40% of the, depending on who's doing the polling. Some pollsters seem suspiciously to come up with higher numbers, others suspiciously with lower numbers, but it's hovering between 35 and 40%. So well short of the 50% plus one, which is the theoretical position which the PQ says is necessary in order to achieve sovereignty, everybody within the PQ knows that in the negotiations that would ensue with the rest of Canada and the attempt at gaining international recognition for sovereignty, you probably better get a little bit more than 50% plus one. You have to get, something probably more on the order of 55 to 60 in order for the negotiation to have any chance of giving rise to sovereignty. So basically, you have a shortfall, right? You have the PQ has managed to ride the charter to a point where, until about a week ago, if I'd given this talk a week ago, I would have given a slightly different talk. Until about a week ago, it looked like they would be able, because of the way in which the vote is distributed in Quebec, get about 35 to 36% of the popular vote. About a year ago, they were down around 28, 29, and that might be enough to get a majority of seats in the legislature, right? You still have a 20-point shortfall. What are you going to, so how are you going to, how is this charter thing, which I've been presenting very much within the logic of the sovereignist movement, right? How are you going to get it to do more for you than simply get you that electoral majority? And here's where, I want to try to explain, that's in the second part of my presentation, try to give an account for the robustness of the appeal that the Charter has had in Quebec. So again, if you look at the numbers, support for the Charter is slightly over 50%. It's about half of the population that unambiguously says, yes, we are for the Charter. Now, the other half, it's not that the other half says no, there's a lot of undecided, so you have something like 50, 38, 12 is the last poll that I saw. Amongst Francophones, Anglophones, I think, are 132% against the Charter. So amongst Francophones, it's more like a 60-40 split. A majority of Francophones support it. So where is it getting all of its support? I've been presenting it as this sovereignist tool, and yet sovereignty isn't very high in the polls. So what's going on here? Well, what I would suggest, and I think that this is fairly easy to make out, is that the Charter has become different things to different people, whether by explicit design on the part of the PQ or for other reasons. People have been reading into the Charter other political ends, other political priorities that they have had. So I think that there are at least 3 or 4 political constituencies that are being served by the Charter. The first, I won't go into any great detail because I've been talking about it for the first 20 minutes of my presentation. These are basically conservative nationalists who have been waiting on the sidelines while the de-ethnicized, de-nationalized version of Quebec sovereignty played itself out for a decade, right? People who've been standing on the sidelines saying, okay, now it's our turn to try to do it our way. These are conservative nationalists, and I'm small c conservative nationalists, who really think that the nationalist movement should rest upon the historically rooted community of French Canadians, of old stock French Canadians, their historical experience, their values, their sense of political priorities. But you have at least 2 or 3 other groups who have also read things into the Charter that has explained their continuing support for it. One of those areas of support, these are not perfectly sort of, if you look at Venn diagrams, there's some overlap between the groups. Another group that has really viewed the Charter with positively are people who view the Charter as the last chapter in the modernization of the Quebec state. Modernization of the Quebec state, in ways which are probably unique to Quebec, given its history, has meant the gradual eclipsing, the gradual sidelining of the Catholic Church from important aspects of Quebec society. So I want to use one gentleman who is somebody who I admire greatly and with whom I've debated, always very courteously and respectfully about the Charter, a gentleman by the name of Guy Rocher. Guy Rocher, I don't use PowerPoint, so if I had PowerPoint, I would, there'd be his name and it'd be spelt, it's R-O-C-H-E-R, and you'd have his face, but maybe it's just because I'm lazy, or maybe it's because I want, there's something, I just want all attention to be trained upon me rather than pictures. So I want to use the picture of the image of Guy Rocher, or the figure of Guy Rocher, is emblematic of what I'm talking about here. Guy Rocher is our most eminent sociologist. He is a figure in French Canada who is probably as eminent and as important as Charles Taylor is in English Quebec and in English Canada. He is a sociologist. He was the author of a document which stands as good a claim as any to be the kind of blueprint for the Quiet Revolution. That document is the Parent Report, which basically created the modern Quebec educational system. Until the 1950s, education was run by the churches, Catholic and Protestant, right? And the Parent Report basically created the Ministry of Education, created a modern curriculum for a modern society, created the school board system that we have, and created a kind of educational philosophy that would justify wresting responsibility for education from the hands of the church and placing it in the hands of the state. Huge 3-volume report, which is still read today. Probably 500 doctoral dissertations have been written on it. And he was a young sociologist who was instrumental in drafting the report. So education, key to the creation of a new modern Quebec state, really has to do, modernizing education has to do with getting religion out, with getting the church out. So if you are, so Guy Rocher, who is now 85, grand old man of Quebec letters and public life, looks at the charter, and what does he see? Right? He sees the completion of a process that he began with the Parent Report. Right? We did not completely do away with the marginalization and sidelining of religion from public life with the Parent Report. We didn't go all the way. There were political exigencies which required us to compromise. Religious accommodations are one of those compromises. Right? The church still had some power. There's the nasty Canadian Charter. There's all these political realities that made it the case that we couldn't go all the way. The Charter, in telling us that religious accommodations are not going to be abolished, but they're going to be regimented much more tightly than had been the case up until now. And especially the idea that public officials, so, the thing about the Charter that has attracted the most attention, negative attention, is Article 5, which says that if you draw a public salary from the state, right, and that's about 25% of the economy, depending on how you define things, like 25 to 30% of the economy. If you draw a salary from the state, you cannot wear a conspicuous, if there's time, we'll return to that. By the way, Bill, you should tell me when to shut up. Bill would often, I'd be talking around the kitchen table and he'd get up and just go to bed and I'd continue talking. When should I stop? Around it? Another 15 minutes or so? Another 10 minutes. 10, okay. So now I lost my train of thought. Conspicuous. So we could get back to the conspicuous, during the question period. But, at the heart of it, and if you're looking at it with the eyes of a Guy Rocher, and I'm using Guy Rocher as an emblem or as a symbol for a whole generation of intellectuals, who really saw the marginalization of the church as central to the modernization of Quebec society. You see Article 5 of the Charter as one of the ways in which we are completing an incomplete part of the modernization of Quebec society by requiring of all officials of the state, people who draw a salary from the state, that they present themselves to the public neutrally, in a religiously neutral way, right? So that's really a first constituency that, aside from conservative nationalists. Now, these people tend to be at loggerheads, right? Conservative nationalists tend to be people who like a lot of the old sort of religious aspects of Quebec society. The modernizers, the Guy Rochers, are people who want to do away with that. How do you square the circle, and how do you get them all on board with the same charter? Well, you do it in this sort of tricky way. So people who have been to Quebec know that in the National Assembly, the legislative chamber in Quebec, behind the seat of the Speaker of the National Assembly, there is a crucifix, right? When the Taylor-Bouchard report was handed down, the report which was commissioned by the Liberal Party in order to look into the issue of religious accommodation, one of the recommendations had been, and it was known that it was going to be one of the recommendations because part of the reports were leaked. I know who leaked it. I was on the advisory committee. Wasn't me. One of the recommendations was going to be that the crucifix be taken down and that it be moved to another room in the building of the National Assembly. About 20 minutes, and I mean that literally, after the report was officially handed down in a press conference, Jean Charest, the Liberal Premier, called a unanimous vote of the National Assembly to assert that the crucifix would stay there. Now, how could this be? completely incoherent. We want to get rid of the church, right? Which is what the modernizers want, and the conservative nationalists want to keep religious symbols. Well, you do it by an interesting process of what I call reverse transubstantiation. Reverse transubstantiation is a process whereby you take a religious symbol and say that it's not religious, right? So you take a religious symbol like a crucifix and you say, well, this isn't religious because we're not looking at it religiously anymore. We're looking at it as part of our patrimony. It has patrimonial status, and it is important for us that we as Quebecers not erase the marks of our heritage, even aspects of our heritage which we might have a complicated, maybe even sort of problematic negative relationship to. The crucifix stays. If you read the text of the Charter, right, in detail, the Charter is actually a modification of Quebec's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And one of the things that it does is it enjoins judges who will be interpreting the Charter in its reformed state to consider the importance of preserving Quebec patrimony in applying the strictures of the Charter. So the Charter says no religious symbols anywhere. Certainly not on the heads and bodies of people who serve the public, who draw a salary from the public purse. But it has an interpretive clause which says that judges should interpret this in a way which takes into account the patrimonial importance of certain symbols. Through reverse transubstantiation, conservative nationalists and modernizing reformers are reconciled. A third group, which I want to mention, and again, I really don't want to caricature anything here, because I think that all of these voices are voices that are important and that have valid things to say. The third voice, which has been extremely important and is extremely important right now in the election campaign, is the feminist voice. Right? A lot of feminists have risen up to say it isn't really about religious symbols at the end of the day. Right? Kippas that Jewish men wear, the turbans that Sikh men wear, we don't really care about them. Were these the only religious symbols that we had to worry about in Quebec, there'd be no debate about the Charter, right? What we really care about, and now I'm speaking with the voice of at least some of the feminists who are running for office under the PQ banner in this election, defending the Charter, who have been militant advocates of it in the public sphere. What we are opposed to is symbols of female subjection, which religions have historically always been prone to imposing upon their women, but which one religion in particular today is particularly troubling with respect to that point, which is Islam, right? So, not to put too fine a point on it, what is being aimed at here is the hijab. And to a lesser degree, although it comes up surprisingly often in public discourse, given how few of them there actually are on the streets of Montreal, things like the niqab, which completely cover the woman's face and body. I've lived in Montreal almost all my life. I have seen exactly one niqab woman, although apparently there are parts of Montreal where you can see 4. It is not... Just to give you an idea of the numbers that are involved here, the Muslim population of Quebec is at about 3 to 4%. 60% of largely professionals, right? We have a selective immigration system, as we all know, in Canada and in Quebec. So these are people who were brought in on a point system where we've selected them as professionals. The vast, vast, vast majority of Muslims have the same attitude to their religion as most Jews and Catholics have towards theirs, which is that they are, occasional, they practice their religion occasionally. And they do the best they can, as many of us do, in trying to reconcile a resolutely modern life with a continuing, at least partial, cleaving to some religious strictures. The number of women in Montreal who wear hijab is growing. It's certainly more than when I was a kid, but we're really talking about a few thousand people in a population of going on 8 million. But the importance that they have taken up in the public imagination, and in particular in the concerns of especially older feminists. And again, this is where old feminism and the modernizing project kind of come out of the same place. Women in Quebec, so Claire Leroux-Dubé, who is retired Supreme Court Justice, a lot of older women, Jeannette Bertrand, people have heard about Les Jeannettes. Does that, Jeannette Bertrand, a very important cultural figure, all women in their 70s and 80s are basically concerned that religious accommodation is a way of bringing in through the back door the priests that were kicked out after so arduous a struggle in the 50s and 60s, right? And the attitude of these women is, this has been the battle of our lives. This has been the battle of our lifetimes. We have struggled in order to give to our daughters and our granddaughters a society where equality of men and women is the norm rather than some far-off ideal. And here we have these well-meaning but completely, misguided ideals of multiculturalism, of excessive, concern about individual rights, badly construed, undoing all the work that we did, right? And tolerating and even celebrating the fact that we have all these women wearing hijab, which we see as symbols of female subjection. They are a way through which women are being told, these are the standards of modesty to which you must cleave. To some degree, you must be less seen in the public sphere than men are. Now, the feminist movement in Quebec is deeply divided on this issue, deeply divided. Institutionally, you can see it in the Commission du Statut de la Femme, which is the governmental organization which has this mandate, the promotion of the interests and rights of women, which is largely in favor of the Charter, and the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, which is it's an NGO, tends to be made up of younger women, more multicultural, multi-ethnic group, which is ferociously opposed to it, right? And the acrimony between these two groups is unlike, the acrimony at any other level of the debate. It's actually quite awful and quite sad. But this is, the third constituency, I would say, that has been on board. Sovereignty, in a way, for them is secondary or even tertiary. Right? What is important is the way in which the Charter can be presented as a vehicle for the further promotion of the ideal of equality of men and women. Right? I know that my time is running out, and I'm just going to add a fourth sort of constituency. I think that these three first constituencies are ones that, though the Charter, first of all, does not serve their goals particularly well, and even if it did, I think it has deep ethical and juridical problems that they don't take seriously enough. I nonetheless think that these three voices are ones that need to be taken seriously in the debate, right? Conservative nationalists in Quebec are people who have a fear that there's something about Quebec that is more vulnerable perhaps than other parts of Canada because of the language, because of the culture. And their fears, although exaggerated perhaps, are not ones that are completely to be shrugged aside. And the concerns of modernizers and feminists are also quite legitimate, although again, I add, there is no real evidence to suggest that the Charter is an effective vehicle for their goals, and it has very deep ethical and juridical problems that they don't take seriously enough. The fourth voice, and I'll just finish perhaps with this, is the voice of Islamophobia, which is a little bit different from the feminist voice, right? The feminist voice is about women are being oppressed. The Islamophobic voice is Muslims are trying to take over. Now, given the numbers that I very quickly sort of threw out, that might seem completely insane to you, but there is a candidate running for the Parti Québécois in a very prominent, high-profile riding in Montreal today who has written sort of conspiracy theory stuff about Muslims in Quebec. People may have heard the controversy about the halal tax, right? That all meat in Quebec, all meat that everybody eats in Quebec is actually slaughtered in a ritual in a way that is that makes it halal and also kosher by the same token, and that the monies that are levied in order to get the halal certification is funneled straight back into conservative or radical, should I say, madrasa in Pakistan, which are training terrorists to come and do us all kinds of harm. So there is an Islamophobic agenda, and one of the most disturbing things about the government, about the party, is that the government has, rather than saying, look, we really should not go on about this Islamophobic stuff, look at the numbers, look at the constitution of our Muslim community, we really have no problem with radical fundamentalism here. The minister who has been in charge of this portfolio, Bernard Drinville, who's the Minister of Democratic Institutions and Public Participation, or words to that effect, has gone on television time and time again to tell Quebecers, you are either with us on the Charter or you are for religious fundamentalism. Right? It's either fundamentalism or the Charter. And when he says religious fundamentalism, I can tell you that he does not mean Sikh fundamentalism or Jewish religious fundamentalism. It's all about Muslim fundamentalism. Ludicrous and objectionable, but unfortunately politically... That's okay. Politically quite effective in Quebec and in a lot of other parts of the world as well. So, I think that something that might not be seen as well in the rest of Canada as it is in Quebec is, the degree to which the robustness of the Charter, the robustness of the support, is not just due to the fact that, basically all Quebecers have become xenophobic overnight or something like that. It is because people see in the Charter a number of different things, and there's enough in the Charter to feed the things that they want to see for them not to, seem as completely, out of their minds. So I think that the Charter has managed to maintain a coalition of people who normally would have no business being in political cahoots with one another: feminists, conservative nationalists, state modernizers. And the question that we are facing in the next 2 or 3 weeks is whether that coalition will, whether the PQ will be able to ride that coalition to an electoral majority. I'll end in the last minute by, I'm sure that people are, wanting to get a little bit of a word from the ground. When we initially planned this talk, we didn't know that we'd be in the midst of a campaign. We didn't know that we'd be on the day of the debate. And it looks like the answer to my question is that it probably won't. It probably won't be effective. 2 reasons which I think are, right now as we speak, eroding the support for the Parti Québécois. One of them just has to do with the fact that at the end of the day, Quebecers don't want to have a referendum anytime soon. 60% of Quebecers are opposed to sovereignty. The interesting, and you would think paradoxical, but when you think about it, perhaps not so paradoxical, fact is that of the 40% roughly who are in favor of sovereignty, about half of that number don't want a referendum anytime soon. The 2 referendum episodes that I've lived through in my lifetime have been very divisive, very exhausting political episodes that have taken the society a long time to recover from. And I think there are a lot of people who say, look, if you ask me the question, I'll say yes, but I really would rather you didn't ask me the question. So it's very easy at the end of the day for opposition parties and for the Liberals today to look at the party and say, look, Article 1 of your Constitution says that the raison d'etre of the party is to take Quebec out of Canada. You cannot soft sell the sovereignty and referendum issue beyond a certain point without becoming completely incredible and unbelievable. So I think that the referendum fear is one that has resonated. And the other thing is that, and this has to do with the strange complexity of the coalition that I spent the last half hour trying to describe. Conservative nationalists who are for the Charter are not necessarily pro-sovereignty, right? They are being conservative in their disposition, small c conservative, basically worried about change. Immigration brings about change. Religious diversity brings about change. But sovereignty brings about big-time change, which at the end of the day, a lot of people who support the Charter may be more scared of than they are in favor of the Charter. And it doesn't look right now like the PQ is able to bring the energy of the support for the Charter wholly into support for electing them as a government. So if I had to make a prediction today, I would say that it's looking like we'll get at most a PQ minority government, which would be a disaster for the PQ at this stage, because a month or a month and a half ago it looked like they would easily be able to ride into a majority government status, or perhaps even a Liberal government. But that doesn't mean, and I'll end with this, that doesn't mean that the issues that I've been talking about are going to go away anytime soon. Identity concerns are part of what being a Quebecer is about, is being worried about one's identity, trying to figure out exactly how one fits into Canada, North America, into the broader world. So those issues aren't going away anytime soon. I struck an optimistic note a minute ago in saying that I don't think that the PQ is going to win. That optimism if you don't want the PQ to win, pessimism if you want them to win. I'll really end this time with perhaps a more pessimistic note, which is that one of the most worrying things of the last few months in Quebec is that the debate around the Charter, above and beyond what's on the page, right? Debate around the Charter has opened up a Pandora's box. It has liberated a kind of talk in Quebec which I had never heard before. It has made permissible certain kinds of statements in the public sphere, not just amongst ordinary citizens, but amongst pundits and indeed amongst politicians. When you have a minister responsible for democratic institutions who's capable of looking at the demographic reality of Quebec and say that we have problems with Muslim fundamentalism in Quebec, right? This means that the problem has reached the highest ranks of Quebec society. A concern. If the PQ is defeated, that voice, that energy, is still going to be looking for an outlet. And my concern is that if the PQ dissolves or is rent, sort of ripped apart by the result of the next election, we might see the emergence of something quite a bit nastier in terms of a sort of resolutely and unashamedly sort of right-wing Front National-like political entity that the PQ is not at this point, but that they have, perhaps through just political calculation, opened up the political space for. And that would be a very great concern indeed. On that optimistic note, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Daniel. You learned a whole lot more about what's going on in Quebec by listening to Daniel than you would have learned by watching the debate, I think.
Probably right, actually.
And we also have, I think, safely said, a whole different context for watching the Quebec election unfold in the next couple of weeks than we would have had otherwise. And so it's an important election for Quebec and for the whole country, and so that's a very valuable thing indeed. So we're going to have some questions, hopefully. Hope there are questions. I just want to remind the people who are live streaming tonight's proceedings to touch the chat button, and Katie will help us work those questions in. For both people live streaming and people here who want to ask questions, we understand that sometimes questions take a little bit of context. But we would like you to go as directly to a direct question as quickly as possible, so that we can get as many questions in as possible.
Do you want me to police them? Or?
Daniel, I've asked or suggested that I might moderate, but I think you're up to doing that on your own.
It's up to you,
right? The one thing we do want you to do, though, is to repeat the question, so that the people watching live stream can understand what the question was asked. Okay. So I think there's the first questions are right down here in front.
All right, this gentleman over there as well.
Yep. One of the big surprises in Quebec politics of recent years was the election of the 50-odd NDP federal. And I know provincial politics usually trumps federal politics when you're in Quebec and the scene, but and given that Tom Mulcair is in Montreal and everything, how and it strikes me that they're very quiet generally, these 50 NDP people. But how have they been treading around the Charter of values? That's my first question. My second question is more about the role of public intellectuals. What should we be doing?
Yeah. So the first question is they've been very careful, right? Quebecers have always been very difficult to understand. Their electoral behavior is very difficult to understand. When I was growing up, they were electing Pierre-Éliott Trudeau, a staunch federalist, to power in Ottawa, and René Lévesque to power in Quebec. And so, the idea that there should be coherence as between the federal and the provincial vote is something that doesn't necessarily occur to a lot of my fellow citizens. I don't say that as a criticism. I think that there are different issues that come up and different political constellations. The disappearance of the Bloc Québécois, so Tom Mulcair has been extremely quiet. If you look at the basis of his support in Quebec, it is to some degree in Montreal, where speaking out very strongly against the Charter would get him a lot of political capital. But it has also, in ways that surprised every single observer of the election, bar none, been in rural areas who had before that given maybe, there are places that gave 15,000 votes to a picture on a poster, where in the election before, the analogous picture on the poster had gotten 250 votes. understanding what happened is still, but that area, which is, sort of the suburban and maybe rural areas that the NDP did very well in, are also areas where the charter is very popular. And so looking at the next election next year, they are really in a bit of a bind. So the public intellectual thing is, I haven't been repeating the question. So what is the role for public intellectuals? This has been really a very difficult thing for public intellectuals because, on merit, I think that the anti-charter intellectuals have won the debate just about on all points, right? There is no Islamic threat. The feminist causes, which we all support, are not well served by telling women that they are benighted idiots who can't make up their own minds, and by turfing them from the access point to the labor market, which will give them, perhaps a balance of power with respect to their husbands that they wouldn't have if they didn't have a salary. We make these points, and yet they go nowhere. The PQ has had a very effective way of, so the vast majority of political philosophers, of constitutionalists, 95% have said this is terrible. This won't stand up. This is, altering your own charter in order to make it a less protective tool for minorities. This is just awful stuff. And yet, the way that they received it is, well, that's the intellectuals. They're disconnected. They're disconnected from the voice of the people. There is a populism that is at work amongst the PQ, and populism amongst PQ leaders who are themselves intellectuals. Jean-François Lisée, my former colleague at Université de Montréal, who's someone who I know quite well, is someone who, arguably has been the puppet master, according to some accounts. He's an intellectual, right? But he has managed to find a discourse for marginalizing the discourse of intellectuals. I think at the end of the day that what might be more effective is not so much public intellectuals making the arguments, but, the reality of having more Muslim women, veiled women, stand up and say, well, I work as I can give you an anecdote which would be too long to recount, but, I'm a veiled woman. I'm an engineer. I have 15 men working under me at Lavalin, and my husband would rather that I didn't wear the veil, actually, because he wants us to, but it's my choice. And you know what? I don't owe you an account. I've seen Muslim women in rooms like this one say things like that, and the effect, right? I can make my arguments about, the Oakes test and, and people's eyes glaze over. But when a woman like that stands up and says, don't treat me like a, victim of false consciousness in the hands of a patriarchal culture. I make up my own mind. And by the way, I'm a powerful woman who, runs a business or who's an engineer. You can see the tone of a room change. And I think that sort of thing might be more effective than a bunch of us public intellectuals making the same arguments again and again.
It's a little thing, but you refer to the Jacques Parizeau infamous l'agent technique comment. It's interesting to note that in the campaign before that, one of the central pieces of the rhetoric was in fact publicly.
Yeah.
So in fact, I would argue that already that element was being brought in for a number of other purposes. So my fundamental question is really a certain puzzlement. I certainly don't like the Quebec Charter, and it's helpful. I think it privileges a Northern European perspective on the world. It's not even neutral and rational, and assumes that there's this thing called secularism rather than the real pluralism that most people have to deal with. All those things are problematic, but they pale in comparison with the citizenship proposals that are also on the table from the Parti Québécois. And I've been astonished how little attention they've received, both in the press and from public intellectuals.
So you're talking about things like the language requirements and...
I mean, it was actually in the proposal for the last election.
Yeah.
It's put on the back burner.
No, you're absolutely right. When I said, I had to go fast, and I probably didn't go fast enough. So the question had to do with the fact that there are other policy proposals that are there with the Parti Québécois today that are much more problematic. Some of them having to do with access to citizenship. The language requirements that would be foisted on immigrants for citizenship. I'd say two aspects to the answer. The first is. As a lot of people have just noted, until we get a sovereign Quebec, which we're not going to get anytime soon, there is no such thing as Quebec citizenship in a sense, right? So it's kind of more of a paper lion or a paper tiger than anything. That being said, I mentioned, and you're absolutely right, and the general point holds, that the Charter has been the visible sort of tip of an iceberg that contains a lot of other identity-ish kinds of policies to do with teaching of a very kind of ideological history, to do with extending the language laws in various points. You know, I run an institute, and so I have to shepherd my young faculty through tenure, and you know, and these are things that don't really register because they're subtle, but the language requirements have been increased, right? Now, it's not an indefensible thing to say that you would have, you know, the level of French that we required of people in order to get their certificat du Québec, you know, for immigration purposes, should be a little bit more than it was before. But if you see it as part of this larger sort of range of policies, it takes on a slightly different meaning. But no, you're absolutely right. You know, if you actually look at the provisions of the Charter and the number of people that they will affect, because at the end of the day there are only a couple of thousand women wearing hijab. Other aspects of the PQ's policies in the identity area should probably have gotten more attention than they have. But there's a path dependency. Once everybody starts talking about the Charter, it becomes the thing that you have to talk about. But it is part of a larger set of identity promoting policies.
Is it the normal liberal democratic first past the post two-party system is troubled in Quebec because one party for a while now has been nationalist and the other one...
All parties are nationalists in Quebec.
Yeah. The other one only slightly differently nationalist, right?
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, will it necessarily be such a disaster if the PQ gets elected? Madeline said, you know, essentially the Charter of Values necessarily, but not necessarily the Charter of Values.
Well, they're not. She's not saying that today.
I think, you know, as with the sovereignty referendum tension, things that will get you elected are not necessarily what you do afterwards.
No, that's absolutely right. So the question is whether it would be such a disaster if Marois were to get elected, because the things that you do to get elected aren't necessarily the things that you do when you are elected. I think that's a very good point. And, you know, I actually I'm part of a shameless self-promotion. I'm part of a current affairs blog that has just been launched with 3 other colleagues from across Canada called In Due Course, induecourse.ca. And, you know, one of the things that in one of my first blog postings, I said, you know, that I wouldn't be surprised. I didn't go as far as to say that I would predict, but I wouldn't be surprised if they had achieved a majority, the PQ had then turned around and introduced a much watered down version of the Charter for political reasons. You know, you've driven the wedge politics into you know, majority territory where you can get a majority of seats with 36 or 37% of the vote. And now your priority is no longer, you know, getting the majority of the seats. It is getting the 55% support that you need for a successful referendum bid. Now there are 2 theories about how you do that. One is the hardline road, which is you just create as many constitutional conflicts with Ottawa as you can. With the Supreme Court as you can. You're going to challenge the Charter? Let's make it as challengeable as possible so that it'll get challenged. Quebecers, and I think this is just human nature, you know, there's this weird, I may not want X, but if you tell me that I can't have X, well, that might change things, you know. I may want to. So, you know, there are a number of issues, assisted suicide and euthanasia, the Bill 52 that will probably get passed if the PQ is re-elected, which I am entirely in support of. You know, where you have a potential for constitutional challenge after constitutional challenge, and the PQ turning to the population saying, you see, we told you, Canada is a prison for us. The other, softer road, which is, I think, one that perhaps they would be well advised to take, is just to project a more inclusive. So imagine this. They get elected with a majority, and then they continue consulting about the Charter, and they say, we've listened. We've heard the voices. We've heard the concerns, and so in the Bouchard-Taylor report, people are familiar with the Bouchard-Taylor report, the recommendation is that the prohibition on religious signs be limited to the people who embody the coercive power of the state. police officers, judges, the President of the National Assembly, a very limited range of people. Vast support for the Charter. 3 former premiers of the Parti Québécois have said this is what the PQ should do. We've listened. We've moderated this provision. 70% of Quebecers would go along with it. And they would start looking much more like the kind of rainbow coalition that you need in order to... So I think you're absolutely right. You know, in many respects, and this is the paradox of Quebec politics these days, which is that in pretty much every other respect except for the identity politics file, the PQ is much more progressive. They've been clumsy about certain policy issues, but they're much more progressive than a lot of other. And certainly, when you look to Ottawa, you know, it's a much. So, you know, I think the Charter is, and this whole range of identity issues is very problematic for the future of Quebec as an inclusive society. But there are other aspects of their policies which I'm perfectly happy with. And if you consider that it would be rational for them perhaps to water down the identity things in order to get the vast coalition that they need in order to make a sovereignty bid, you know, maybe the Charter is... I'm answering very long-windedly. One of the things that made me think that they weren't really interested in enforcing the Charter, but rather just in advertising it, has to do with the lack of attention that you get in the Charter text about enforcement, right? So at the end of the day, this is about employment, and the logical implication of the Charter is that if, say, a woman working in a daycare is, you know, told once, twice, 3 times, you have to take on your hijab, and she says no, then she loses her job. Quebecers who support the Charter also are opposed to people losing their jobs over the Charter. When you tell them, well, that's kind of what the Charter is about, again, coherence, you know, is perhaps an overblown. So the PQ knows this. The PQ does the math as well. And so the fact that they have been as wishy-washy when Drainville, the minister, is cornered by a journalist, you know, what are you going to do about enforcement? Are you going to fire people? You don't get an answer. You get evasion. And this suggests to me that at the end of the day, this was about winning the election. It was never really, but we'll see. Sorry, though I'm going to try to be briefer in my... Oh, yeah. Oh, and... So there's a question online.
Yep.
How have unions like QP, as an example, taken a position towards the Charter? The union movement has been... has been divided. I don't know who I'm talking to. Hello, computer. The union movement has been divided, but I would say that by and large it has been opposed to the Charter in this radical version. I debated Louise Baudouin, who is a former minister, very staunch secularist, at the big centrale of the FTQ, the Fédération des Travailleurs du Québec, which is one of the big labor federations, and I was expecting to be really in hostile territory, you know, massively Québécois de souche, 500-600 people in the room. And, you know, all the questions were not so much questions of principle, but questions of, you know, I don't see myself as somebody who's responsible for 30 workers going and telling somebody who, I don't see that as compatible with my role, right, as a union member. And so it wasn't at a level of defense of individual rights, but for reasons that have to do with the pragmatics of what it would mean to enforce this in a union context, that a lot of unions have been have had misgivings about the Charter, at least in the form that we have it now. I wouldn't want to give there are some unions that have been for it. The main teachers union is in favor of it. So it's not a unanimous thing, but I would say that the balance, as far as I can tell, has been that the union movement has not been completely on board.
I don't know if it's so much a question as an observation that I'm wondering what you think about it. I was in Quebec during the last referendum, and my sense is what you said, it's a deeply fatiguing thing. And
it's a trauma.
It's a trauma, and leading up to it, there was really no desire whatsoever in the areas that I was living, in Chicoutimi and in the Mackinac Islands, that for anybody to want to talk about it. But yet, when you turn on the TV, it's being bantered back and forth. The institution, the institutional representatives are all in debate. And it almost seems to me it was the flip of what you get in Anglophone Canada, whereas the general population is wanting to debate and discuss things, but we keep looking at our institutions and going, why are you not actually talking about what we're talking about?
Right.
It seemed that the fascination with Quebec was that, and English Canada, was that, oh, you're actually talking about the type of things that we want to talk about, but when you're actually there's a sense in the communities, at least that I was in, that those conversations aren't taken.
I think they ended up, the thing about the charter is, I come from a culture where we tend to argue about anything. There's no censorship on what we argue about, and sometimes arguments can be very hurtful when you don't censor them. And I married an English woman where where the culture is very much about there's certain things you just don't argue about. There's certain things that even if you feel them, you repress them. And I always thought repressing things is bad, right? It's bad to repress. And years into this relationship, I realized maybe not. Maybe repressing. So I've been at dinners in Francophone families where the question, and back in the referendum days, where the question, where you could get the feeling there was tension in the air, and you could. At some point, somebody says something, and it opens up the Pandora's box, and before you know it, people are yelling at each other, and people are slamming doors, and it's tiring. I mean, families were divided down the middle by the referendum question in '95, in the same way as people are divided by the charter. People are talking about the charter all the time, and arguing about the charter, fighting about the charter, calling each other names over the charter. Would rather not be, but once the thing is released, there it is. You have to talk about it. So my experience of the referendum is therefore a little bit different from yours, which is that we don't want it, but once it's launched, there we are getting into it. And once it's finished, we're all exhausted, and we have to repair bridges with people who we call nasty names. And for me, that the logic of, if you ask me, I'll vote yes, but I really don't want to go through this again, or not anytime soon, right? Is not incoherent. And the charter, the charter debate, when I travel, I went to New York last week for a conference. I'm going to Portland, Oregon tomorrow. I feel my blood pressure probably go down like 30 points, when I'm in another place, because the tension in the air for the last 6 months, especially for someone who's quite involved in these debates, has been, it's almost a physical presence in the lives of a lot of people probably just go about their lives not talking about it. But for those of us who do, and I think it is expanding as a conversation within Quebec society, it's been very deep and wounding, and yeah. Oh, another question from the... What juridical problems, as you briefly referred to, will the charter present if enacted? Well, if it's enacted in its... So I read the question there, so I can answer it. Well, we live in a constitutional culture in which essentially, and I think, the constitutional test and the general philosophical or ethical test are kind of on all fours with one another. The idea is that we don't live in a rights... So it's clear that the provisions of the charter that prohibit people from wearing religious symbols limit people's religious freedoms. Nobody's really denying that. We don't live in a rights absolutist culture. We do say that sometimes rights can be limited if, first of all, there is a clear and important societal end that is being aimed at by the limitation of the right, and if people can show that there's a rational connection between the limitation of the right and the end, and if the limitation is as parsimonious as possible, right? So limit rights if you want to, but if you must, but really show that you must, and when you must, show that you're being as, economical as possible in the limitation of the rights. I think on all those scores, the charter fails. There's really no, problem of rampant religious, excess that is being aimed at. And where there are certain problems, like, nobody's going to deny that equality of men and women is still a goal that is a work in progress. There's no rational connection. There's really no rational connection that anybody can show between limiting women's rights to wear hijab and women's equality, given the fact that women who wear hijab are being told that they are unequal because benighted in their own self-conception and excluded from the labor market. So I think that, what we refer to as the Oakes test, which is really just a kind of liberal democratic attempt at balancing the importance of individual rights and societal concerns in ways that don't completely tip over into the collectivity taking over the individual's rights. I think that it just is very problematic. Whatever the lens you view the Charter through, whether you view it as an instrument for women's and equality, whether you view it as an instrument for, there is no threat that our institutions are going to be taken over by religious forces anytime soon. So I think that those proportionality tests that we take seriously in order to limit the degree to which rights are limited, are ones that test has failed, I think, massively by the Charter.
Daniel, I think there's one more question we can take.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's a different subject.
Yep.
You were totally silent on the business sector.
Right.
Company owners and so
yep.
on. And my instinct would be that the Charter might be a deterrent to people wanting to immigrate to Quebec. Even not on the specifics, but just the general tone of something like that. And I would think that would make corporations very nervous.
Yeah.
Because they want to bring more people in.
Right.
Could you comment on their view?
Yeah, I think that one of the big miscalculations. So the question had to do with the attitude of the business community, the idea that the business community might be reticent about the Charter because it would make it more difficult to bring in talented people or retain talented people in the province. And I think the answer to the question is you're absolutely right. The business community has spoken almost with one voice, and I do say almost, in being opposed to the Charter. It's clear when you're a business person that what you want is the best, right? Rather than, what they wear, right? You want the best minds. People are probably familiar, maybe not. 2 or 3 days after the bill was introduced in the National Assembly, some hospital in Toronto had an ad with a woman doctor with a hijab, and the caption was, we're interested in what's in your head, not what's on it. And, this is basically telling McGill medical students, or, come go west, young woman. And, this is true of just about every... So, I think that this... One thing we didn't talk about, because it really wasn't the topic of the presentation, last week the PQ introduced with great fanfare its star candidate, Pierre-Carl Pelado, who is one of our most successful businessmen, the owner of the consortium that Media Empire. And clearly, their calculation was that this would be a way to reassure the business community. Look, if you have a guy like PKP saying that he's on board with the PQ, and then it must be okay, right? Everything's going to be fine. So not only has the business community not really followed that lead, but the arrival of PKP has cost them votes because, the first thing that he did when he got off on the podium to announce his candidacy was to raise his fist in the air and say that he wanted an independent country that he could give to his children. A noble sentiment, and not one that the community, that the electorate was wanting to hear. And his arrival seems to have been met with complete indifference by the business community, which, as far as I can tell, is very worried about the economic impact of the Charter, perhaps even more than of sovereignty. Business is all about breaking down borders and bringing in the best, and the Charter may definitely have a chilling impact on that. So certainly the Montreal Chamber of Commerce, has said, we're really not interested in the Charter. Now, the last thing I'll say is that, their voice, in a way, is secondary to the debate, because the Charter really just does apply to people who draw a salary from the public purse, right? 2 days ago, Madame Marois, in trying to refocus the debate by relaunching the Charter, said, if businesses want to restrict people's headdress, then the Charter will allow them to do that as well, which is complete nonsense, because Article 10 of the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms, prohibits discrimination on precisely the grounds that Madame Marois was saying, that in virtue of something in the Charter, that the Charter of Values that I haven't seen, that would somehow be taken away. So the business community, in a way, is not as affected, but it is just in virtue of the chilling effect that this has on the prospect of Quebec being able to attract top, being able to compete in what has become an international competition for the best immigrants, to put it slightly crudely, they have been pretty much PKP or no PKP on the sidelines of this.
Those are great questions, folks. Appreciate that very much. Unfortunately, it's all the time we have for questions tonight. I'm going to call on Kevin Kindred from SESEPA to thank Daniel and wrap up this evening's proceedings.
Thank you very much. Good evening. As you know, I'm Kevin Kindred. I'm the chair of the program committee of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. I'm also part of the part-time faculty here at the law school, so we're happy to be here. I mentioned that just because I was teaching right up until 7 and arrived just a few minutes late for the presentation, so my apologies for that. SESEPA, which you may know, is an organization that was co-founded by St. Mary's and the Atlantic School of Theology, and our mandate is to provide a forum and an arena for critical thinking, public discussion, and research into current ethical challenges in our society. On behalf of the board and the staff of the center, I'd like to thank the Siegelberg Trust, Bill Leahy and David Stewie specifically for their partnership in this event, and of course I'd like to thank you, Daniel, for your amazing presentation tonight. This is really an issue that I think you could approach from the perspective of an interest in Quebec politics and culture, but this room has been very engaged for reasons that go beyond that. I think this is a question that the rest of Canada is paying attention to, not just because we care about what goes on in Quebec, but because it speaks to broader questions that trouble us about pluralism and secularism and immigration and accommodation and feminism. And it's sort of a lightning rod for a lot of issues that continue to trouble us, whether we're in or outside of Quebec. So I really appreciate your providing us such an informed perspective on all of that. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for being part of the discussion, and I'd like to thank our live stream audience. I will remind you, and Chris will get mad at me if I don't remind you, to, first of all, the live stream audience, there's an evaluation form or something somewhere on your screen. Please click now. And if you're here in person, you'll see that there are more traditional slips of paper in front of you. I will say it's my committee of SESEPA, the program committee, that takes all of this input and digests it, and it just does not go into our shredder. We have long debates and discussions about the sorts of things that you give us in this evaluation, so please do give us your feedback. It's very, very important to us in the work that we do. On behalf of SESEPA, I'd also like to remind you there's some information on the table that you'll see on your way out, and some DVDs of past programs that you might find interesting. We also have some things coming up that you might find interesting. So Tuesday, March 25th, we have a presentation called Francis, Faith, Culture, Media, and Morality. If you've seen the posters, they're great. They're Pope Francis as a superhero. Dr. David Dean from the Atlantic School of Theology will be presenting on that. I'm really looking forward to that presentation. And we have something else new that we've tried this year at SESEPA, which is our Everyday Ethics Lunchtime Talks, which take place at the SESEPA Boardroom on Franklin Street, which is on the campus of the Atlantic School of Theology. We have two that are coming up. Wednesday, April 23rd, from 12 to 1 p.m. We have David Fraser, who is one of Canada's leading experts on privacy and technology law. He'll be speaking about cyberbullying, the law, and free expression on the internet. That's a topic that I think we have some unique perspectives on in Nova Scotia. And then on Thursday, May 1st, again at the SESEPA Boardroom, 12 p.m., Consumer Racial Profiling in Nova Scotia, How the Friendliness of Maritimers Contrasts with Reality. And that is Dr. Judy Haven of St. Mary's University. Also, an issue that I think will be really fascinating to hear more about. Our lunchtime ethics discussions, our everyday ethics discussions, are designed to be a bit more casual and a bit more engaging. We try to approach them as conversations as much as presentations. So please do come out to that if either of those two topics are of interest to you. So again, our sincere thanks to you and to our audience at home, and especially to Dr. Daniel Weinstock, and thank you again for the